Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Capucci. I'm the Stephen Jaroslavsky Chair in Religion and Conflict at Assumption University. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's guest lecture from Father Deacon Andrew Bennett, entitled Particular Amnesia, Religious Freedom, and the Pitfalls of Secularism. I would also like to extend a very and special, I'm going to try to pronounce this, Laskavo Prosimo, to our Ukrainian friends from St. Vladimir's and Olga Parish, and also for co-sponsoring this event. I'm going to give a brief biography of Father Deacon Andrew, and then I'll pass the microphone or the podium to him. The Reverend Deacon Andrew Bennett is the director of the Cardis Religious Freedom Institute and program director of Cardis Law. He also serves as senior fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based Religious Freedom Institute. He is an ordained deacon in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Eparchy, which is a diocese of Toronto in Eastern Canada. Father Deacon Andrew served as Canada's first ambassador for religious freedom and head of the Office of Religious Freedom from 2013 to 2016, during which time he led in championing religious freedom internationally as a core element of Canada's principled foreign policy. As director of Cardis Religious Freedom Institute, Father Deacon Andrew leads the CRFI's research into strengthening the national network of religious freedom advocates around the world. The Freedom Institute operates in a bridge-building capacity, providing a link between the research and the advocates who use it, and provides language to help express why religious freedom is important in how it relates to public life. In conjunction with his work at Cardis, Father Deacon Andrew holds the position of Senior Fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. as well. The RFI is an independent think tank committed to achieving broad acceptance of religious liberty and fundamental human rights, which is the cornerstone of successful society and a source of national security. Father Deacon also, it's a long biography, Father Deacon Andrew also holds a PhD in politics from the University of Edinburgh, as well as degrees from McGill and Dalhousie. While not praying, studying, or advocating, Father Deacon Andrew can be found with his fly rod in a stream, listening to the bluegrass or Bach, or reading the Church Fathers. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Father Deacon Andrew Bennett.
Well, thank you very much, John. That's a very kind welcome. I'm going to get into my talk in a minute, but I was asked by John when I initially gave the topic for this talk. He said, we'd like to learn a little bit more about your time as ambassador. So as I talk, you're getting a bit of the Andrew Bennett show here, but I will speak about these slides afterwards. But I wanted to give you just a bit of a visual presentation of some of the work that I did and some moments in my time as ambassador for religious freedom that profoundly shaped me and shaped my religious vocation. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory forever.
Byzantine shout out there. Very good. So thanks again very much, John, for the kind introduction, as I said, and for your magnanimous welcome to Assumption and to, or should I say, Dormition University here in Windsor, and to time here in Windsor. In the Byzantine Rite, we speak about the Dormition of the Mother of God instead of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Theology is roughly the same. But I want to also extend a thanks to my good friend and fellow Greek Catholic cleric, Father Tom Hrivna, for his parish's co-sponsoring with Assumption of this event. Father Tom, as always, your generous and pastoral heart shines through in all the things you and Presbytera Annette do. So thank you for your friendship, and Windsor is blessed to have such a priest as you in this community. So I'm here with you today, this evening, to speak about one of the most fundamental freedoms that we bear as human beings. Freedom of religion, to which we might add also freedom of conscience, because I think the two are bound in various different ways. John, in inviting me here today, again, as I said, wanted me to speak a bit about my experience as Canada's first ambassador for religious freedom. and what I learned in that role. And I did learn many things. Things that maybe I anticipated, and many things that I did not and could not have anticipated. I saw a lot. I saw a lot of persecution and the effects of persecution. And I gained a lot from that blessed work. The most important thing was a clearer sense of my religious vocation. My vocation to be a deacon and, God willing, a priest one day. Yet my experience as ambassador profoundly shaped my diaconal service. And in that diaconia being a call to witness to the importance of living a public faith, something that we are all called to exercise our religious freedom. And I also feel that having experienced this work as ambassador, it really called me to support others who want to live a vibrant public faith. And what does that look like? What do we require to do that? Why is this so important? Why is living a public faith so important? Why is religious freedom important? Because religious freedom is essentially about a public faith. We're always free in our internal life of faith. The internal forum is where we are free. Even if we're in prison, we are still free to pray. But religious freedom is fundamentally about living our faith out publicly. And to enable the human person to live their lives fully, both individually and in community. It's about how robust religious freedom within our society, within our public square, is essential for democracy and for a deep pluralism, where people with profoundly different beliefs can live together and build a common life. A life that must be oriented towards the common good, and that common good of human flourishing. That's a lot of the work that I do now, as a deacon certainly, but also in my work with Cardis and with the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington. It's about living that common life. And how do we do that with people that we often profoundly disagree with? To help us grasp the importance of religious freedom, I will first look this evening briefly at religious freedom in the world today and highlight some of my experiences as ambassador and what they taught me. Secondly, I want to reflect upon how we have in our society in Canada and in many Western democracies developed an amnesia. An amnesia about what religious freedom is and is not. And I'm going to argue that this amnesia has been compounded by the effects of an official, elite-driven secularism that often seeks to marginalize voices of faith in our society. How has a narrow secularist worldview impeded Western democracies in engaging the vast majority of societies in our world which have a deep current, a deep religious current running within them? How has an inability to engage abroad in talking about religious freedom a symptom of the amnesia that we have at home? Before launching into my main argument, I'd like to focus on how we understand religious freedom. What do we mean when we say religious freedom? And what is the current state of religious freedom in the world today? So I'll focus first on the international side, and then I want to draw some connections and then talk a bit about the domestic side. So what is religious freedom? Before I get into answering that specific question, I want to clarify some terms. Freedom of religion is not just about freedom for Christians to practice their faith. It's not just about freedom for people of a religious persuasion to live out their faith. Genuine religious freedom has to encompass all of that, but also must allow people who have no religious belief whatsoever, who maybe might ascribe to a particular philosophical view, to live that out as well. So religious freedom must encompass within it the freedom to live out a theistic religious belief, and also the freedom not to have any belief. When I speak about secular, if I'm using the term secular, I want to distinguish between secular and secularist or secularism. I employ the term secular in its modern usage vis-a-vis the state, vis-a-vis government. Specifically, I'm speaking about the philosophical underpinnings of contemporary Western democracies in North America and Western Europe, and how those underpinnings shape the relationship among individual human persons who constitute civil society, who constitute that common life, and their relationship to the state. So this refers specifically to a state where there is no established faith, or where there is an established faith or an established church, such as in the United Kingdom, yet religious freedom is guaranteed and upheld in law and by the legislatures and by the courts. A secular state is also, in this context, where all beliefs, religious or otherwise, are permitted to flourish and their adherents to express their beliefs in public and private, subject to such reasonable limits under law in a free and democratic society. Now, secularism. When I speak about secularism and I use that word, what I mean is the context of a specific belief system that excludes the open display of religious belief in society, including in institutions and in daily life. So let me now move on to discuss what we mean by religious freedom, and then talk a little bit about the state of religious freedom in the world today as a bit of a backdrop. For those of us who are advocates of religious freedom, those that are engaged in international affairs, in foreign policy, in academia, looking at religious freedom questions, we often look to the field of international human rights as the arbiter of what religious freedom is. So for example, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a product of the United Nations in the late 1940s, coming out of the Second World War, there is Article 18 within that declaration. And to paraphrase what Article 18 says about religious freedom, it says that people have the freedom to practice their faith in public and in private, to worship in peace and security, to engage in missionary activity, if that's what their faith calls them to, such as Christianity or Mormonism or Islam. They have the freedom to change their faith, which I think is the real litmus test of whether a country has religious freedom. Are you permitted to change your faith without being penalized or persecuted for doing so? And then, as I said before, it also must necessarily encompass the freedom not to believe in God, but to have maybe a different philosophical belief that's not related to religious faith. But it's not sufficient just to hang our hat on that definition. We have to go deeper. If we simply look at international human rights law, we're not getting to the heart of what religious freedom actually is. There's much more to it. I would say that religious freedom is about having the freedom to publicly pose and contemplate questions such as, who am I? Who am I in relationship to you? Who am I in relationship to the world in which I live, to my local community? Who am I in relationship to God? Or again, if I don't have a religious belief, who am I in relationship to some particular worldview that I choose to follow? The noted Canadian-American legal philosopher and Jewish scholar Rabbi David Novak at the University of Toronto presents what I would argue is a clear and helpful understanding of the right to freedom of religion and how it is to be understood in the relationship between the state and the individual human person. So Novak defines religious freedom in this way, building upon what I've just stated. An individual's freedom from the totalizing authority of the state. When the state embraces a totalizing authority, in other words, it seeks to have jurisdiction in all aspects of life. When the state embraces a totalizing authority in all matters of human society, and therefore against religious freedom, we have secularism. Again, this is secularism as an exclusivist ideology, an exclusivist philosophy, distinct from the secular states. That's why I made that distinction early on. The secular state is to be neutral in matters of religious expression, rather than prescriptive or to dictate a particular religion or towards an enforced secularism, which banishes any religious expression from the public square. For Novak, human autonomy is the foundation of the moral law, and so the freedom possessed by all human beings to see God or not see God as the ultimate author of the moral law, or we might say the natural law. Indeed, as Rabbi David Novak argues, and I would agree, religion addresses a deep metaphysical need for human beings. A deep metaphysical need that we have within us, that we possess simply by being human. And despite all sorts of predictions to the contrary, since the Enlightenment, religion has not disappeared. The fact that we're standing here or sitting here tonight just after Mass concluded is a wonderful example and illustration of that. No, religion has not disappeared. Religious faith has not disappeared. That metaphysical need that we have is still there. It's persisted in both ancient forms and developed new forms as well over many, many millennia of human existence. All those different forms, all those different religious forms, respond to this metaphysical need of humanity. Finally, Rabbi Novak points out that secularism, on the contrary, seeks the assimilation of religious individuals and communities to the state as the temporal authority, where no public expression of religious belief is to be tolerated, and private expressions of religious belief are viewed with suspicion and are often judged to be detrimental to the broader society, against perhaps a certain set of prescribed values. So the importance of religious freedom vis-a-vis enabling humanity to respond and meet this metaphysical need, to respond to that sense that we have in each of us of that need to answer those questions that I talked about. Who am I? Who am I in relationship to you, in relationship to God? That need, that sense, has been profoundly expressed in the Catholic tradition in that seminal document on religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, from the Second Vatican Council. So isn't it interesting that that document on religious freedom from the Council is referring constantly to human dignity, Dignitatis Humanae. So I'm going to quote sort of an extensive passage from that, which sums up this link between religious freedom and who we are as human beings, getting back to that point of David Novak's about that metaphysical need we have. So, here's what Dignitatis Humanae has to say. Quote, "The right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself, the human reason that we possess, which is a gift from God, we have to remember. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law, whereby society is governed, and thus it is to become a civil right. We would call it a fundamental freedom here in Canada. It is in accordance with their dignity as persons, that is, beings endowed with reason and free will, and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility, that all human beings should be at once impelled by nature and also bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth." So much of our human existence is about seeking truth. What is true? And for those of us who are Christians, we know that truth is not some abstract philosophy. Truth is a person, the incarnate Son of God. To go back to the quotation, they are impelled by nature and also bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. They, human beings, are also bound to adhere to the truth once it is known, and to order their whole lives in accord with the demands of truth. However, human beings cannot discharge these obligations to pursue truth in a manner in keeping with their own nature unless they enjoy immunity from external coercion, as well as psychological freedom. Therefore, the right to religious freedom has its foundation not in the subjective disposition of the person, but in his very nature. So again, we bear religious freedom simply by being a human being, as we bear fundamental freedoms generally. And I'll get into that in a minute. So we see here the primacy of human dignity. Echoes of this same understanding of religious freedom being linked to human dignity can also be found in traditions as diverse as Judaism and also the Baha'i faith. My own defense of religious freedom, whether it's when I was ambassador or merely as Father Deacon Andrew, is grounded in two related aspects of myself. I believe in the inherent dignity of every human being, and that this dignity is realized in a particular way through how we express our faith, how we live our faith. Secondly, and necessarily connecting with the first point, I'm a devout Catholic who publicly and privately professes the truth of the Incarnation. I believe that Jesus Christ is the incarnate Son of God, who suffered and died a human death, who was raised on the third day for our salvation, who ascended into heaven, and now sits at the right hand of the Father. I believe this to be universally and objectively true. In other words, it is true for you as much as it is for me. Now, there are going to be a lot of people in our society who are going to profoundly disagree with that statement. And that's okay. But we have to be able to make that profession, publicly and privately. So my understanding of human dignity is based upon this absolute necessity of recognizing the image and likeness of God in every human being. This latter fact, that I need to see that image and likeness, calls me to champion the right to religious freedom for all people, whether they have a religious faith or whether they're atheists or secular humanists, whether they're Christian or Muslim or Hindu or Yazidi. I am going to disagree with my non-Catholic Christian neighbors about Marian theology, about the Eucharist, about how the church is structured. I'm going to disagree even more profoundly with my non-Christian neighbors. But I must respect their freedom of religion while at the same time encouraging them implicitly and explicitly to come to know Christ. Now that's a tricky business. So how do you do that? So my exercise of religious freedom affords me that opportunity and so much more. To exercise our religious freedom is not simply to worship. And if there's one thing you take away from tonight, freedom of religion is not simply freedom to worship. Because we have to live the liturgy after the liturgy. When you are sent out from church or from whatever place of worship you go to, you can't just sit back in your duff and not do anything. You have to live out that faith. That's what we're called to do. So religious freedom is much more than simply being able to be within the four walls of the church or the synagogue or the mosque, wherever it might be. No, it's to act upon what our faith teaches and to undertake those activities that match our beliefs, that undergird our beliefs, actions that are quite often at the service of the whole community, not just Catholics, not just Christians. Whether it's establishing a faith-based hospital that caters to all people, whether it's a crisis pregnancy center, a school, or an In From the Cold program that doesn't discriminate. In many countries throughout the world, people of faith are not able to exercise their beliefs, not even to worship. And in many cases, they face repression and persecution, often by the most violent means you can contemplate. And probably some, thank God, you can't contemplate. But I have seen. So now I want to move on to talk a bit about international religious freedom. Religious freedom violations typically come in two forms: government restrictions where through laws or regulations or by harassment or whatever, the government limits what certain religious communities are able to do publicly and privately. The second form of violations of religious freedom is in the form of social hostilities, where one group commits violent acts against another group who they disagree with because of their religious beliefs. These types of religious persecution are studied in depth through the almost annually Pew Research Center's Trends in Global Restrictions on Religion. These are significant surveys done by the Pew Forum Research Center in Washington, D.C. They've developed a very robust methodology that looks at these two aspects of violations of religious freedom. Government restrictions on the one hand, social hostilities on the other hand. So here's a little taste, a little snapshot of religious freedom in the world. In not the most recent survey, but the one that I had the most information from, the 2016 Pew Research Center survey on global restrictions in religion, 24% of the 198 countries included in the study had high or very high levels of government restrictions on religious practice. 23% of countries experienced high or very high social hostilities involving religion. Now you might think, that's not so bad. Now, although only about a quarter of the countries included in the study fall into the most religiously restrictive categories, government restrictions, social hostilities, it's important to note that some of the most restrictive countries, such as China, Indonesia, and Pakistan, are very populous. Some of the most populous countries in the world. India is another one. As a result, according to the 2016 Pew report, roughly 3/4 of the world's 7.2 billion people, 74% in 2016, were living in countries with high or very high restrictions on religious freedom or social hostilities. 3/4 of the world's population. Furthermore, of the nearly 200 countries and territories included, 198 to be specific, in the study, 41% had religion-related terrorist activities in that year. So, we have to keep things in perspective. Do we have challenges in Canada on religious freedom? We do. But compared to what's going on in many parts of the world, it's apples and oranges. Let me move on to what I see as some of the pitfalls in engaging religious freedom. Actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to pause just for a second, and I'm going to explain some of these slides you saw. So we'll come back to that. This is a photograph of St. Mary's Coptic Orthodox Cathedral in Mississauga, the ordination of the first consecration of the first Coptic bishop for Canada, Bishop Mina. The Coptic community is brutally persecuted in Egypt, and they're now growing in numbers in Canada by the grace of God. This is in Lahore, Pakistan, at the second largest mosque in the world, with the imam talking about Islam and religious freedom. It was about plus 42 that day, if I remember correctly. These are some wonderful Christians in Joseph Colony in Lahore, Pakistan. They suffered a firebomb attack just before I was there in March 2014 because one of their numbers was accused of blaspheming Muhammad. These are the signs that I saw while I was there. These are mostly Catholics, some Anglicans. Very, very small, very poor community. I had to give a shout out to our patriarch. This is Patriarch Sviatoslav Shevchuk, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Patriarch, meeting with Prime Minister Harper and other folks talking about the situation in Ukraine and religious freedom issues there in the midst of the conflict with Russia. This is the shrine of the Bab, sort of the John the Baptist of the Baha'i faith in Haifa in Israel. The Baha'i community has suffered grave religious persecution, especially in Iran, many other Muslim majority countries. This is just above the main door of the synagogue in Rome, the great synagogue of Rome, in the old Jewish ghetto, as they call it, in Rome. Very unique Jewish community that's been there since before Christ. This is at the Assyrian Church of the East Cathedral in Mississauga, with their Bishop Mar Emanuel, one of the great ancient apostolic churches, the Church of Baghdad, that evangelized as far east as China by the 9th century. This is a list of Jewish families who fought against fascism in Rome, and they're honored by this plaque on the side of the synagogue. This is the dome over the Shrine of the Bab in Haifa, the center of the Baha'i faith. Beautiful gardens. If you ever have a chance to go to Israel, make sure you see the Baha'i gardens in Haifa. I showed my dad these photos and he thought, I'll never accomplish that. This is at a Romanian Orthodox monastery in a place called, translates as Sinai in English, Sinaia, in the foothills of the Transylvanian mountains, the Carpathians. This is me with His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in Constantinople. Some people call it Istanbul. He is the successor to the Apostle Andrew, just as Pope Francis is the successor to Peter. So I'm Andrew standing with Andrew. That's self-explanatory. He's got a great laugh. We spent most of the time kind of joking. This is walking through Joseph Colony in Lahore with the former Anglican Bishop of Lahore. These people are under constant threat of being attacked for their Christian faith. Most of them are scrap metal dealers, domestic servants. This is the monastery in Sinaia. But as we were walking through that street of Joseph Colony that had just been firebombed and was rebuilt by the government, there are probably 150, 200 people walking through these streets with me, shouting at the top of their lungs, "King of Kings, Jesus King, Alleluia." And I thought, these are Christians. This is Pope Tawadros, the only other apostolic successor, also called Pope. He's the Patriarch of Alexandria for the Coptic Orthodox Church. This is a group of seminarians in Lviv, in Ukraine, just a couple months after the revolution in Kyiv. And they asked me one interesting question. They said, "Are we doing the right thing?" I said, "You are doing the right thing." Because that revolution has been christened the revolution of human dignity. And the churches were very active in that. So again, in Lahore, Pakistan. This is now the Bishop of Chicago, Bishop Benedict. He's a Studite monk. You can tell by his eyes that he is a very holy man. You spend even just an hour with him, it's like a mini retreat. This is a mosque in Astana, in Kazakhstan. Astana is kind of like Regina with space-age architecture. This was built with Qatari money. The Saudis and the Qataris have a lot of influence. This is during the revolution in Kyiv. This is a typical shot of Orthodox or Greek Catholic clergy protecting the people. This is what I received when I entered the streets in Joseph Colony in Pakistan. I was overwhelmed. It was like a scene of that film Gandhi. But they were so happy that someone came to hear their story. This is with some Shia leaders in London. The Shia are persecuted in most countries apart from where they're the majority, Iraq and Iran. This is with Metropolitan Sotirios, standing to my left, your right, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop for Canada, and a group of Oriental Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox clergy at Easter. They call themselves the Funny Hat Club. Again, another scene from Joseph Colony, where a lot of the people, their last name is Mosque, which means Messiah. So they really bear their faith. This is at the Fanad in Constantinople, where the Ecumenical Patriarch is based. This is a door that is never opened, because this is where Patriarch Gregorios V was hanged after being dragged from his cathedral by the Ottoman Turks in the 18th century. Anyway, we'll just let it play. So I was very blessed to see a lot of things which affected me deeply. Let me now connect some things for us. Connect the international dimension, why we need to speak out against what happens as a country that prides itself on having religious freedom. Our foreign policy should be an extension of our domestic policy and our values. Unfortunately, though, it's becoming increasingly hard for us to engage on these questions of religious freedom in Canada, overseas, because we've forgotten what religious freedom is, even though we still broadly enjoy it with some challenges, but I want to get into that now. So I want to talk about what I see as some of the pitfalls of secularism and how an increasingly pervasive secularist mindset has limited our ability in Western societies to speak publicly about religion, to understand the role of religion in international relations, and therefore made it more of a challenge to advance religious freedom beyond our borders. So here are a couple of the pitfalls, and I'll try and illustrate them with some things that came from my experience. So the first pitfall, the most important one, an inability to speak publicly about religion. This is a struggle not only internationally, but it reflects a struggle we have at home. Oh, you can't talk about religion in politics. What a load of nonsense. Anyhow, they're the most exciting things, apart from fly fishing. So let me give you an example about how I experienced this. When each year I would give some formation to outgoing heads of missions, so outgoing ambassadors, consuls general, they would take a week-long course at the Canadian Foreign Services Institute. And when I was heading up the Office of Religious Freedom, I gave a little sort of half-day session on religious freedom. And I remember that first year, I'd just been appointed ambassador, and I gave my spiel. And one of the outgoing ambassadors, who I'm pretty sure is an evangelical Protestant, he was going off to Manila to be our ambassador there, he said, well, Ambassador Bennett, you're a devout Christian. Can you say something about how your faith influences your work? And I said, well, I can't separate my faith from what I do. I can't be a Catholic only at home or only in church. It informs everything I do. Anyway, he wouldn't let me get off just with that. So I had to, he said, no, I want to explain to us what you mean by that. And so I talked about the importance of human dignity, the importance of the Imago Dei, seeing that image and likeness of God. And then we sort of wrapped up with a few more questions, and that was the end of the session. What was interesting is that between the next hour after the session and even a couple of days afterwards, I had about 6 people who were at that session come up to me individually and say something varying, words roughly along these lines. I wish I could say that. I wish I could talk about what you talked about. And I thought, our diplomats can't speak about their faith. How are they going to engage with countries that are profoundly religious? So this is a real sort of epiphany for me. Next pitfall, an inability to converse in a meaningful way with faithful people. There was a lot of surprise amongst religious leaders, first of all, when I would meet with them, especially ones here in Canada, that I actually could speak about religion. And that I wasn't just this ambassador, but I could actually converse with them. And they found that was a tremendous way to build trust. My colleagues thought it was shocking that a public servant would talk about religious beliefs. That this is something you just didn't do. Again, if you can't talk about it, then how do you engage with people? Another pitfall, religion is not an important factor. Approaching foreign policy by looking in a mirror. I heard from Canadian Forces chaplains who had been over in Afghanistan, often when they would meet with the local leadership, and the local leadership would bring their imam or their particular religious leader, and they would always ask the Canadian Forces personnel, where's your guy? And so they would say, where's the padre? We wheel him out. And the imam or the local leader of the community would want to speak to the padre, would want to speak to the chaplain. And the Canadian forces had never thought that this would happen. And so then they had to completely rethink how to engage. Another pitfall, an ignorance, often willful, of religious communities and their plight. And this is the question of weak formation, especially diplomats who just have no clue about religion. And I'll give you a very stark example. A head of mission, I won't say who, but this particular head of mission was based in one country in South Asia, which was a very strong Muslim country, and was the High Commissioner there. Went to another country in South Asia, there's only a few and they all have High Commissioners. Went to another country in South Asia where we were very active and began to serve a term as High Commissioner there. And this diplomat came and met with me and said, you know, I just met with a number of the people that we're doing projects with through your office, and we wanted to get your advice on how to engage them. But I also met with the bishop of this city. And I said, oh, is that the Anglican bishop or the Catholic bishop? And this senior diplomat said, oh, well, I'm an agnostic, I have no idea. And I thought, if I was a bishop and said to you that I just met with a government minister and you asked me, is it the trade minister or the foreign minister, and I said, well, I didn't take political science, I have no idea, you'd think I was rather simple. So we have challenges. So let me just sort of, how am I for time? I'm 5 more minutes? Okay. These pitfalls are a reflection of our own society here in Canada. There is an amnesia at the heart of our political and professional institutions, including our legislatures, our executives, within our public service, and it's steadily taking hold also in our legal community. It manifests in an ignorance about faith and frequently seeks to marginalize faith from the public square. The 2017 Canada Summer Jobs controversy was an example of that. But there's also an amnesia within our faith institutions, the result of which, especially for Christians, has been a privatization of our faith, where we are disinclined or fearful to publicly profess our faith or to live it through courageous witness in the face of values that are advanced in our society that run counter, sometimes violently counter, to what we hold to be true. This amnesia affects not only our Canadian common life, but it can influence how we see other societies, as I just discussed. Choice is a great byword of today's culture. To be pro-choice is to be enlightened, because you are respecting the individual's right to autonomy, to determine individual destiny. Many in our society accept that this applies to women who choose to end pregnancy through abortion, or to young people who choose to self-select their gender. Then why does the power of choice not extend to Canadians who want to choose not to make such choices? Why is it difficult for Canadians to opt for faith-consistent healthcare, for example, that rejects some of these ideas? I think we need to think more about what is pluralism in our society. What does it mean to hold different beliefs? As a Christian, I believe that I have the freedom to exercise my beliefs publicly, and to be able to find in my society ways in which I can live out those beliefs. Maybe I have a desire to establish a hospice to provide compassionate end-of-life care. I need to have the freedom to do that, and not to be conformed to a particular understanding of life that goes against my beliefs. Pierre Trudeau famously stated at the time of the patriation of the Constitution Act in 1982, with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which has as its very first fundamental freedom, freedom of conscience and religion, Pierre Trudeau said, and I'm quoting him directly, "The golden thread of faith is woven throughout the history of Canada, from its earliest beginnings up to the present time." Unquote. This faith is both private and a public faith. A faith lived in the public square. To have a flourishing society where people feel that they can be fully themselves and can embrace the fullness of their citizenship, you cannot separate out a secularized civic public life from a spiritual private life. We are a unity of body, mind, and spirit. We are tripartite human beings. We can't be chopped into little pieces. I am called as a Christian to participate in the life of this country, as are all of you. I'm not called to separate myself off and live completely apart from society. I'm called to be part of the polis. And that polis can extend to the world when we are engaged in international affairs as diplomats. I need to be myself in all aspects of my life, and that's what religious freedom speaks to. In conclusion, I want to just say that it's all too common right now for people to want to immunize themselves from particular opinions or beliefs with which they disagree. They want to somehow shut themselves off from beliefs, opinions, words even, that they find to be a source of conflict. This is what we're seeing in other parts of the world, in much more egregious forms, mind you. Now, when you do that, and you cut people off because you don't like what they think or what they believe or how they live out a religious faith, you're not just cutting yourself off from opinions. You're cutting yourself off from the people who hold them. And you're saying to that person, you don't count. Because your opinion is anathema to me, and so I don't even want to engage you. We have to draw a distinction between the beliefs that people hold that we might disagree with, and the fact that these beliefs are held by people. By human beings who, in our Judeo-Christian understanding, are created in the image and likeness of God. It's much harder these days to find that common ground with those who would advance a highly secular relativist sort of public reason. But that too must change, because we must encounter those who advocate a strongly secularist view and those who would seek to constrain and limit public faith and religious freedom. They too are created in the image and likeness of God, and we must engage them in charity and truth, because we live next to one another. We're neighbors with one another. And we can't have a common life if we don't embrace one another and seek to understand one another, recognizing that there are differences, sometimes deep differences. But that should not take away our ability to see the human person. It's too easy for us to demonize people who hold different opinions from us. We might disagree fundamentally with the opinions and find them and the impact that they're having on our society absolutely abhorrent. But we can only seek to bring about the common good and to advance truth in our society if we communicate with one another, if we engage with one another, if we talk to one another, if we encounter one another in difference, and again, focus on the identity of that person who you're in front of at that moment. This is a very difficult thing to do, but it is absolutely necessary. And my experience dealing with international religious freedom has convinced me of this beyond a shadow of a doubt. Threads, when woven together, can create beautiful fabrics, rich tapestries, and joined together, separate and often different shapes and colors of cloth. So if Pierre Trudeau's statement about the golden thread is true, and I believe it is, then it is our collective responsibility today more than ever to ensure that we preserve this golden thread of religious faith in the life of our country, and that we preserve it radiant and intact, so that we can speak to other countries and engage with others. Please God, we will succeed in upholding freedom of religion in our society and reaffirming the importance of a vibrant public faith. This must be our chief preoccupation today as people of faith, as we live out our faith in the public square. Thank you very much for your attention and for the invitation.
I want to thank Father Deacon Andrew for such an engaging and thought-provoking lecture. Again, thank you.